everybody. Welcome back to the Playmakers Corner podcast. I am your host for this slew of season previews, Kodey Stoffer here, and I'm going to be taking us through some 2A action today as well as some 1A action as well. And I'm very excited to talk about these teams, talk about how they did last season, what they have to move on without as far as their class of 24, and some returning playmakers that are going to help them for this next season, and then going to go ahead and project what their record is for the upcoming 24 season. So let's go ahead and jump right into it here. The very first team that we're going to have on this episode is none other than Montezuma Cortez, the Panthers here. And looking back at last season, they had a crazy postseason run a couple of years ago. Don't know if y'all remembered, where they strung together an upset or two that was pretty electric as a lower seed. I want to say they were like a 12 or a 14, something like that. And, they were returning a handful of talent from that past year. So, there were some thoughts that they might be something to look out for here. And, they had a solid season. They clawed their way to 4-5, beating the likes of Kirtland Central, that is an out-of-state team, Ignacio, Salida, and Bayfield. However, they would lose to a different out-of-state team in Aztec, as well as some really good teams here like Rifle and North Fork. And, with their postseason hopes on the line, they just lost by 3 points to eventual postseason attendee and future segment on this episode, Pagosa Springs. And then Delta kind of put the final nail in the coffin in a big way here. So they fell just below 500. Obviously, you can't go 500 in this 2A setup with the 9-game schedule here. But, I think that they have a lot to look forward to. But before we look ahead, let's look back at some of the guys who were important to this team for that class of 24. I'm looking primarily at the defense that is going to get hit kind of hard up near the top here. 3 of the top 4 tacklers were class of 24 guys, primarily headlined by Marcus Harris, who had 81 total tackles and 7 of those being for loss. But you also got to look at Dean York and Cash Clark. Both had big solo tackle numbers, and York himself had 3 tackles for loss. Cash Clark was also impertinent in the pass defense game here, banking in 3 interceptions to go with a team-high 4 forced fumbles, that is. And something else that Harris contributed to this squad here was he did get to the quarterback 5 times, scratch that, as far as getting pressure and getting those sacks. So, some heavy hitters on the defensive side of the ball that they will miss next year. But let's talk about some of the guys who will be coming back and trying to return Montezuma Cortez to the playoffs and maybe go on another magical run here. The primary name here is and has been Tay Wheat here, the primary offensive option. He had over 160 touches last year and 1,708 scrimmage yards, with 1,436 of those coming on the ground, as well as 15 touchdowns. And, while you are losing some playmakers on the defensive side of the ball, you do get him coming back. He was a force, picking off 3 passes and had 97 return yards off those turnovers. Just an incredible athlete there, able to do so much for this squad. You also get Colby McMillan. He's going to return for his senior year after passing for 555 yards and rushing for another 350 and rushing for 7 scores, but almost threw thrice as many interceptions as he did touchdowns. He's going to have to reduce those turnovers for this offense to have the ball more and be able to capitalize if they want to have hope of making the postseason. Other names that come back on the defensive side of the ball, you got Aiden Ray and Dalton Muzzy here. They combined for 14 tackles for loss, Muzzy leading the way at 9. And then you also get sophomore Rusty Snyder, who is second on the team in tackles with 56 and also logged an interception. And I did actually have to go to the school website here, but it should be an interesting season. They start off the season in New Mexico, actually, against Gallup in Gallup, New Mexico. That game is on August 23rd. They then follow that up against Crown Point, also in New Mexico, the following week, before finally getting their first home game of the season against Strasburg, a new addition to the 2A scene, whose recap was an episode ago, so go give that a listen. And then they are back home against Shiprock, and then on the road against Gunnison, Salida at home, Alamosa at home, Pagosa Springs on the road, and Bayfield at home. So, looking at this schedule here, now I think it's going to be a bit of a mixed bag for those New Mexico games. I think that they should beat Shiprock, in my opinion. I think that is a very winnable game. Aztec is, going to be a tough one for the JV squad, but, they don't have to do the exact same matchup this year as they are going to face Gallup and Crown Point. Now, we'll see what happens with those squads, but, they should hopefully get a win there because they could be looking at an 0-3 start before getting their first win against Shiprock, just because Strasburg, I think, is going to push this team, but they have the benefit of playing at home. So that is going to be huge for Montezuma Cortez. They then have their league play here, which is going to include Gunnison, who is also new to 2A as well, or newer, I should say, Salida, Alamosa, Pagosa Springs, and Bayfield. Honestly, I like what a lot of these other teams are returning as well. It should be a very competitive league, but I don't favor them in the Alamosa game. I don't think I favor them in the Gunnison game, if I'm being completely honest. And then they have a solid chance to beat Salida and Bayfield. So if we are taking this schedule at its best, I think that they could maybe win 6 games at the absolute maximum. But I think that 5-4 is a bit more reasonable, and a repeat of 4-5 is also very, very possible as well. So that gives this team a window of wins between 4 to 6, but I'm going to predict a record of 5-4 for the Montezuma Cortez Panthers, and maybe with strength of schedule, depending on how some of these other teams do and some of these out-of-state matchups, they might be able to sneak into the postseason. One of those teams, of course, being the Alamosa Mean Moose that Montezuma will have to play for a league title here. And let's go ahead and talk about last year where, after a start that was probably as bad as it could have been with 5 straight losses to start the season, the competitiveness was easily overlooked as they lost to some heavyweights like TCA by only a single point, Pagosa Springs by 9, before rattling off 4 straight wins to close the season. Most importantly, a 2-point win over Florence in Florence did just enough to push them in the playoffs, where they would fall to the eventual state champions, Delta here. But Alamosa still shrugging off a rough start to the season and finishing very, very strong, and with some electricity as well to put them in a spot to compete in the postseason. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the players in that senior class that were impertinent. You cannot talk about the Mean Moose of 23 without talking about Brant Jackson. He had been one of the premier players in 2A, and his senior season did not disappoint, as he caught 45 passes for 810 yards and 7 scores. They also had senior receiver Michael Motz, who caught for 400 yards and 4 scores in this group. And overall, this team loses 75% of receiving yards who walked across the stage, leaving plenty of room and shoes to be filled. Also, last year you have RJ Mais here and Carter Tolsma, who went for over 800 combined yards and a touchdown for every 100 yards last season. And Mais and Tolsma were also the leading tacklers in the senior class with 93 combined tackles. And of their 20 TFLs, Tolsma notched 13 of his own. And then bringing it back a little bit, Jackson and Motz here also found themselves in the backfield 11 total times, with Brant recording 8 of those TFLs. So some big-time losses from some top-end players here. But we have some intriguing talent that will be coming back. I'm looking at Dyson Woodward. He was a huge proponent for this offense, passing for 1,887 yards and running for another 619, going for a combined 23 scores. You also had Kevin Gonzalez, who went for nearly 500 yards and 3 scores. And then flipping it over to the defensive side of the ball, you got to appreciate some Garcia contributions here, with the likes of Landon Garcia being the tackle leader with over 6.5 per game and 9 of those in the backfield. Carlos Garcia was also very important here, going for 45 tackles and 2 for loss, but really shined, leading the team with 3 interceptions and 8 pass deflections here. And if this pass defense could roll with fellow defenders Ryan Higarita here and Tony Griego, who also notched 2 interceptions apiece and a collective 4 pass breakups, this could be one of the sneaky good defenses of 2A here, and they bring back just enough offensive contributions here. I don't know if they'll be as dynamic this year, but who knows, especially if Woodward here takes a big step his senior year. Now, looking ahead to this schedule here, they do start off at home with 2 contests here against Monte Vista and Banning Lewis Academy. I do think that they have a decent chance to start off 2-0 here and at least a chance to go 1-1 in these games to put them at a better start than they did last year. They then have to go to Pueblo Central. I think that that's a tough game, but you do have the benefit of playing a 3A squad, which is going to be great for your schedule strength. They then have Delta, which is going to be their last non-league game here, where I think that they should do pretty well here, but I'm still going to favor Delta. So I think at worst, in a nightmare scenario, you're heading into league at 1-3, but you are very battle tested, and at best, I think that you're looking at 2-2. And so going into league against Bayfield, I definitely have Alamosa favored. Gunnison is going to be an interesting contest here, and Gunnison's going to be pretty big up front. This game could really go either way, but the Mean Moose do have the benefit of playing at home, but I'm still going to lean Gunnison just slightly. Against Montezuma Cortez, I do think that this is a win. I just kind of like some of the contributors that are coming back for Alamosa here. They do play that game on the road, so wouldn't be too surprised if that is a loss. And then at Salida, that is going to be an interesting matchup, but I do have Alamosa favored in that one. And then I am going to favor them at home against Pagosa Springs to get revenge for last year. Pagosa Springs, just a really big senior class graduating. I'm going to touch on that a little bit down this episode. But ultimately, I think that this team goes probably 4-1 in league. And they have a chance to go 5-0. And at worst, I don't think they go worse than 3-2, right? So if you do even the at worst possible 3-2 league and 1-4 non-league, that is at least 4 wins. However, I do think that they're going to do a lot better than that. I think that this team is looking at a potential 6-3 season. Now, I'm going to project them to go 6-3 here in this league. Actually, they even have a ceiling of 7 wins, honestly, but I'm going to project them to go 6-3 this season, and I do think that they're going to make a return to the postseason as a much higher seed. Now, for the Wolverines here, they kind of slid backwards last season from 2 seasons ago, going 1-8. They had some big losses, but they also had some competitive games. They lost to Aztec by only 6. That's a single score. They lost to Moffat County, who is one of the top teams in 2A last season, by 9. And then everything else felt super out of reach with the exception of the win over Salida, 27-20. Always good to get a win over your league rivals here. But let's go ahead and talk about Bayfield here and some of the departures and some of the returners here. So Kodey Ross was the signal caller for this squad last year, was his senior year. He threw for 1,336 yards and 10 scores, but unfortunately turning the ball over at a slightly higher rate of 13. So yeah, just a little turnover prone there. You also lose Donovan Candelaria, one of the best athletes on this team, 114 carries, 401 yards, and 4 scores his senior year. And then you also had Keaton Pickering, who is a class of 24 cat who eclipsed a century of yards. But Keaton's main forte was catching the ball, going for 445 yards and 4 scores. And then if you look at Pickering, Candelaria, and Archuleta, they all notched almost a combined 200 tackles and 8 TFLs, with Keaton leading the way, collecting a ton of those TFLs at 8, and then Archuleta himself had 6. As far as returning playmakers go, you bring back Lincoln Williams. He was a leading receiver on this team, going for 354 yards and 3 scores. And he will be accompanied by Tyler Harriman here, who went for 194 yards his sophomore season. You have some returning defenders here in Austin Wilmer, Kalen Ramos, and Lincoln Williams. They had over 30 tackles apiece and a combined 8.5 TFLs. And then Estevan Gonzalez led in sacks while also notching an interception and a fumble recovery. So looking ahead to this next season here, there are going to be some more matchups against some New Mexico teams. That just ends up being kind of a common theme for a lot of teams in this league who are really, really down south in that corner there. So, nothing too unexpected, I would say. And so for this team, they will start off with 2 New Mexico matchups here at Aztec versus Gallup. I think that they go 1-1 here. And then they actually have a chance to go 2-1 with a drawing of Ignacio here. But then I think that that's kind of where the good times stop rolling here. They have Centauri, Alamosa, Pagosa Springs, Salida, Gunnison, and Montezuma Cortez. I don't know if they win a single one of those games, because all of those other teams are bringing back a lot more contributors. Even the team that they beat last year in Salida, I think is going to take a step forward. Pagosa Springs, maybe, but they have some top-end talent that is going to return some interesting talent. I don't know if Pagosa is necessarily a playoff team next year, and I'll discuss that, but they are going to be a tough test here. And so Bayfield, I mean, you have those 2 wins early in the season, which is great and all, and I do think that their floor is 2 wins, honestly, but I don't think that their ceiling is much higher. I think it's maybe 4 wins, but I am going to project a 2-7 season for the Wolverines here. Y'all know that it's all good here with the pod here, and I'm hoping that they prove me wrong, but we'll see how this season shakes out for the Wolverines and the handful of returners that they have coming back for next season. Now, moving on to the Spartans here of Salida. They had one of the better turnouts for Spartan football in recent memory. They did bounce back from an early Buena Vista loss, and then rattled off a 16-0 win over Woodland Park, a 39-22 win over Rye, and then a big win over Coal Ridge, as well as a 30-12 win over Del Norte. This is unfortunately where the wheels came off, as they would lose big in 4 of the next 5 games, with those big games being their opponent scoring over 40 points, except for the one close game they lost to Bayfield 27-20 to wrap up their season. This was probably one of the better chances that they had to make a push in their league, but luckily they have a ton of returners coming back for next season to try and make that possible. Outside of the following players here, one of them being Ashton Walker. He piloted this offense, throwing for almost 1,000 yards and 5 scores, but kind of doubled up on the interceptions, kind of helping close that window a little bit. But he made up for it a little bit here with 445 rushing yards and 5 scores, leading the Spartans in that category. And then this entire offense of Connor Gentile, Christopher Graff, Daniel Edgington combined for over 550 yards and combined for 4 scores, while Edgington recorded another 383 yards and 3 scores catching the football here, so a ton of offensive weapons on their way out. Gentile and Edgington also combined for over 60 solo tackles, with Edgington tying for second in the team with interceptions, and Brady Potts, an underclassman here, being the other tie. Kent Shields was the team leader in sacks with a 4-piece here. And then Jace Young did not connect as successfully, but notched 7 hurries. And then Abram Jones and Jace Young had 86 total tackles, with Abram getting 3 TFLs. So why am I still a little confident in this team here? Well, they do return Wyatt Farney. He's the only player with 3 digits of yards coming back, running for 258 and 2 scores. But I do think that this defense has some potential PMC talent here. I'm looking at Kason Pridemore, who was only a freshman and recorded over 100 tackles with a handful for loss. There's also Brody Hudson, who is second on the squad in tackles at 80, as well as 5 in the backfield. You also bring back Bryce Rodriguez, who had 6 interceptions to pace this defense hilariously in turnovers. And then you have a younger Edgington brother in Matthew, who had 2 interceptions as just a sophomore here. So you have some serious playmaking ability on the defensive end that seemed to struggle a little bit last season. And then I think that you have some athletes as well to play with on the offensive end. So let's go ahead and take a look at this schedule here. They do have Buena Vista once again to start. I think they lose that game here. And then Woodland Park, this one is in Woodland Park, so I don't love that as much. And then Florence at Rye, I think, is where they shake off this 3-game losing streak to start the season. Then they have a very competitive game against the likes of Pagosa Springs here. That one could kind of go either way. I like them at home, but I'm still going to give the edge to Pagosa here. Before they then go on the road against Montezuma Cortez, I think that that's probably a loss. I think that they avenge that dropped game against Bayfield from last year to collect a dub, and then I don't think that they beat Alamosa or Gunnison here. So, I think that this team should win 2 games. They might be able to win up to 4, but I'm going to go ahead and project them at a cool 2-7 as well. I think that this is going to be a little bit of a retool here, but I still think that on the high end, they could force that 4-5 record. And now we have one of the more interesting stories from last year's recap here, as the Pirates of Pagosa Springs ran the ball and played tough defense in the perfect possible way en route to a 6-3 record. They would open up the season beating Centauri 20-16 before losing consecutive matchups to La Junta and Florence, with the Huskies game being a heartbreaking 3-point loss before they would bounce back, beating Alamosa in Alamosa by 9 and play the eventual state champs in one of the closest games that the state champs would play all year, pushing them to a 14-7 score. But with Pagosa Springs being on the wrong end of that, they would be in dire straits at 2-3. But they would answer the call, whooping up on Kirtland Central, narrowly beating Montezuma Cortez, as earlier mentioned here, 20-17. And then big wins over Salida and Bayfield to punch a ticket to the playoffs here. I mean, this team just played a lot of close games, and they would keep that up, as in the playoffs, they would avenge their loss to La Junta, winning 14-7 before losing a 3-point game to Eaton in the second round. Honestly, you got to love what this team was able to accomplish here. Overall, they played with a ton of guts last year and played a ton of close games that showed the real grit and culture, I would say, of this program that I think has me pretty hopeful looking ahead to the 24 season. But they will have to do so without some heavy hitters here. You have a big-time contributor who did walk across the stage last year in Gavin Lindahl, a major PMC accolade collector here, who ran the ball a whopping 241 times for 1,440 yards and 16 touchdowns, helping this team grind opponents to a fine dust and burning time. His presence at Pagosa Springs will be legendarily and honorably remembered here, as well as our ability to spotlight him. They also lose the top 3 receiving threats in Seth Aucoin, pacing them all with 420 yards and 4 scores, and then Armijo and Lehner combining for as many scores and over 500 yards. Harley Armijo here notched 84 tackles on the defensive side, with 12 of those being for loss, and made some plays forcing turnovers, recovering 4 fumbles, and picking off opposing quarterbacks 3 times, a whopping 7 turnovers from Harley here. You also lose Blake Lehner here, who had a crazy 12 tackles for loss to go with his 75 total tackles, and the 2 above combined for 12 sacks between Lehner and Armijo here. And then Seth Aucoin was going absolutely ballistic on defense, picking off 6 passes and getting another 27 totals. And as if Gavin wasn't doing enough, he was also interested in making plays on defense with 36 solo tackles and 16 assisted ones. Now, like I said, I love the culture that they got here, and I like some of these returners here. I'm looking at Colton Lucero, who is often utilized in relief of Lindahl as a sophomore, running for 371 yards and 4 touchdowns to complement this team here and that senior leadership. But then on the defensive side of the ball, also showed his chops with 46 tackles and 5 of those being for loss. And of those 46 tackles, the majority being solo at 35, just as a sophomore. This Pirate team will also be returning fellow class of 26 player Creed Dozier, who ran for 200 as well, but at quarterback threw for 924 yards and 8 touchdowns to 6 picks, and will be called on a bit more to throw and run next season with that huge loss of Lindahl. Seth Ziegler here, or Ziegler, got a handful of touches his junior year running the ball and found Pater 3 times, while defensively having 68 tackles, which is easily the highest among returners. And then you also get back Jackson Shield here, 3 interceptions for this squad, and comes back for his senior year, especially after leading everyone in interception return yards. So, like I said, a lot of production to replace, but I like what they have coming back, and they have it at the right positions here. Let's go and talk about this season that they have coming up. Kind of an interesting out-of-league schedule here. They do start off with their very first week against Kirtland Central. The Broncos of Kirtland, New Mexico, unfortunately kind of being a doormat for a handful of Colorado teams last year. And I think that, Pagosa Springs is going to want to keep that up. So I think that Pagosa Springs should beat this team again to start the year, even with it being in New Mexico. Centauri, that's an interesting game. I think that it could go either way. I'm going to ever so slightly probably favor the Falcons with it being in Centauri. But then they're at home versus Monte Vista. I think that they should bounce back with a win there. But I think against Elizabeth, the Cardinals have a ton of defensive talent returning, and I just don't know if this offense is going to be in their rhythm quite yet. And I don't know if they have enough outside presence at the receiver spot to really force Elizabeth to play outside of their comfort zone. So I think that, we're looking at 2-2 here and a possible 3-1 record heading into league, where they have Salida, Bayfield, Alamosa, Gunnison, as well as Montezuma Cortez. And, I think that they actually do pretty well. I like their odds against Salida and Bayfield. Alamosa And Gunnison and Montezuma Cortez, not as much, especially with how they barely beat Montezuma last year. I think that Montezuma's revenge is going to be in tow for this year. So I think that you look at that, and that gets you to a total of 4-5. I really like that for their win total here. I don't really think they should drop to 3 games here. And I don't know. I don't really see, maybe they steal one of those league games. So I kind of like 4-5 as an overall record. Maybe they lose one of these games earlier in the season, but you have a window of wins of 3-5 here. And, it will be a little bit of an experience year for this team, but I still think that they're going to be pretty competitive against a handful of these opponents. And if you want to know how Gunnison is going to do, you're going to have to find them in another preview because we're on to another league here. Obviously, I just discussed the 2A Intermountain League here, but we have the 1A Frontier level here, and I have 5 teams in there, only missing Prospect Ridge Academy. But I do start off with Denver Christian here. Let's go ahead and talk about how they did last year and what we should be looking ahead to this season. So for Denver Christian here, last year they ended up going 4-5. Pretty solid season for the Rolling Thunder here, I should say. Just the Thunder. But, this team benefited from, a first half of the season that was pretty tough, finding a win over Pinnacle, sandwiched between some tough losses, including a really close one to Estes Park, before getting a good old-fashioned W over Middle Park, and then dropping 2 straight games to playoff teams and ending the season on 2 wins, getting closer to 500. Now, some of the players that were contributors there in their senior year included the likes of Nathan Burrer here, after throwing a decent 20 touchdowns to just 10 picks, albeit on a less than ideal completion percentage, but still, those are still good snaps and a lot of scores to be filled at quarterback here. Luke Boyson was the biggest benefactor from Nathan's success here, catching 9 touchdowns on just 24 receptions in an exceptionally sound season. He was also a force in the secondary with 3 interceptions and breaking up 5 passes. Some cats that you lose here include Spallone, Fiss, and Wolf, who all had between 35 to 45 tackles, with Spallone and Fiss having 11 for loss, and Spallone leading all seniors with 7 for loss total. He also led this group in sacks with 3, but Wolf and Fiss had 2 apiece as well. Now, they are returning some very interesting talent. You have two-way stud and linebacker watch list member here, Ben Pereira here, who on offense recorded 668 yards and 8 scores as a tailback and was complemented nicely by Diego Pellegrini's 360 yards and 4 scores. But Ben is way better on defense, going for 143 tackles as well as 14 for loss, flying around the field and disrupting the quarterback as well in the pass rush with 11 sacks and another 8 hurries. Now, outside of Boyson in that pass secondary and in that receiving core here, Elson was the second leading receiver, catching 6 touchdowns and over 400 yards for whoever is up next at that QB spot here. You also bring back Patrick Elson here, who was tied for the team lead in pass breakups and even forced one of those into a turnover. He is shortly followed by Stromberg, who had 3 pass breakups and a fumble recovery during their junior year. Owen Whitney had 7 tackles for loss and 3 sacks of his own his junior year, and overall should help this entire unit take a step forward. And while Pellegrini makes his mark on defense with 69 tackles, he is joined by the other top 4 tacklers in Pereira himself, Carson Romero, and Quinn Barkema, who as a freshman recorded the 3rd most tackles on this team at 57. So they have their run game coming back, and they also have a interesting defense here. And both sides of the ball will be put to an interesting test in week 1 as they face Dayspring Christian Academy here. That is an 8-man team from Greeley, Colorado. They get the benefit of playing at home. That is a game that they should win. I also think that when you look ahead to Estes Park, who is going to be in my last recap, so just make sure that you stay tuned for that. I think that that is a team that they should probably beat this year, even though it is on the road here. And then they face Kent Denver that I think kind of cramps the vibes here and puts them into a 2-1 situation here before they keep moving on here. They face Highland at home. I think that that is going to be a tough game, but I do have Highland just narrowly favored in that one. Before going on the road to Burlington here, Burlington is returning a ton of talent, honestly, and I do think that they could probably end up losing that game on the road here, just with some of the returning talent that the Cougars will have. But it could be a team that they beat as well. Who knows? But they do have 5 non-league games just because their schedule will include, and I will touch on this in a little bit, Sheridan that will not be playing a team here for the varsity level. But anyways, getting back to their league schedule here, they play Platte Canyon. Now, Platte Canyon was the premier team second in their league last year and made the playoffs, but they do have a ton of graduating seniors as well as some returning playmakers. I am still going to favor Platte Canyon in that game before they face Prospect Ridge Academy. They should win that. Flatirons Academy or Forge Christian, I don't like Denver Christian's odds as much here. And so when you look at this season here, you're looking at probably a 4-5 season once again for Denver Christian here. I think that that's a good place for them to sit with at worst 3 games and at best 5 games. But overall, 4-5 for the Thunder 2 years in a row, I think is pretty good, especially considering some of the talent that they will be facing and squaring off against. Now, I hinted at this in the last one here, but let's go ahead and talk about Platte Canyon and the Huskies here out of Bailey, Colorado. Last year, they were legit dominant, winning their first 8 games in a row, with the closest game all season being within only 10 points, and they just rolled the rest of the way. That was until their final matchup with Strasburg for the league title, where Strasburg came into their house and rolled to a big dub that led to them drawing Holyoke in the first round, which wrapped up their season. But I mean, they were just annihilating people on the way, and these were some of the seniors that were a part of that story, starting with Cameron Skogie here at quarterback. He's kind of a mixed bag throwing the ball with an equal amount of TDs to INTs, but on the ground just added another level of this offense here, finding the end zone 13 times and running for over 500 yards. Not to be outdone, though, lead back Sam Patterson carried a heavy workload, literally rushing the ball 175 times for over 1,000 yards and 15 touchdowns for a reliable handoff threat every time. There's also Gregory Oramas, who was splendid his senior year, not only rushing for 211 yards and a few scores, but also leading the team in receptions and yards, going for 18 catches and 423 yards while finding the end zone 3 times. He also had fellow senior Tate Heineman here, who caught 2 of the other scores. And then when you flip it to the defensive side of the ball, the top 4 tacklers were all class of 24 guys. Going down from most to least was Skog with 96 total, Ian Twaddle with 80, Devin Jakobson with 58, and Patterson rounding it out. Twaddle and Patterson were the 2 players who had double-digit TFLs at 16.5 and 10 respectively, and Skog even recorded 5 for loss for 3rd best on the team. Twaddle's pressure in the backfield would play into the pass game as well, as he would sack the quarterback 6.5 times, which made up over half the sacks on this squad. Patterson and Twaddle would both also make their mark in the pass game here, recording 2 interceptions per, and then Patterson would break up 5 passes and recover a fumble. Both of these fellows would pale in comparison to Tate Heineman here, who led the team at 4 interceptions and a kind of insane 135 interception return yards, as well as another 5 pass breakups. And then Aramis here, Gregory, would even break up the most passes on the team with 7 to just add to this secondary that was really hard to pass against, and this team that ran the ball very, very well. So some pretty stacked seniors at the top. Let's see who's coming back this fall. And one of those main contributors is going to be Ty Cole. He did not lead in catches and yards, but his 13 catches for 312 yards was enough to actually lead this team in touchdowns at 4, catching a touchdown basically every 3 receptions. You also get Leo Batzer, who was only a freshman here, but finished with the 4th most yards on the team with 131 rushing yards on 9 carries. And even if you take away his long of 54, he's still averaging a ton of yards per carry, piquing my interest in him as an offensive weapon heading into his sophomore year. We also talked a lot about the talent leaving the defense, but they will welcome back Hayden Simmons, who had an interception and, was second on the team in pass breakups with 6. You also get back Keaton Brown and Quinn Tanner, who are the leading tacklers to return with over 70 tackles between them and 4 TFLs apiece. And then Colton Shirley, an interesting freshman coming back. He was listed at 6'2", 177 pounds, so if that frame fills out or if he gets any bigger, he could be one of the more impactful players on this team. So Platte Canyon here, let's go ahead and take a look at their schedule here this fall and see how that's going to treat them. So they open up against Ray I think that this is unfortunately a loss here to open up the season. And then they're on the road against Highland. I am going to still slightly favor Highland in that game. And then they get Ellicott here. I think that they have a better chance of winning this game. And then they have Colorado Springs Christian in the Springs. I don't think that that's good. So I think at best 1-3 probably out of this stretch. Before they head into league, that's a bit more favorable for them. Like I said, I have them favored over Denver Christian. I have them favored over Prospect Ridge. The Flatirons Academy game honestly could go either way, but I am going to take Flatirons Academy in that game. Forge Christian, I think that one is a loss here. And then for some reason, they have Inglewood slotted in here. So that could be an interesting game at 2A that could decide their fate here. But, I think that this team is looking at a season of probably 3-6, but, at worst 2-7, and at best probably 4-5. This is probably going to be a year where they don't make the playoffs here, but this is a very young team that I should be pretty excited for heading into next year. But for now, I'm going to project a 3-6 season for the Huskies of Platte Canyon. Now turning our focus here to the Fury here in Arvada, Colorado. That is Forge Christian squad here. And last year they were in 2A here, and they charged straight ahead into the season with a big win over Prospect Ridge Academy. And then what I thought was a little bit of a surprise, beat Devlin by 10 before dropping tough road games to Kent, Denver, and Florence prior to league play. This league was tough as they would alternate wins and losses for the next 4 games, beating the Academy, not being able to handle the overwhelming Berthoud squad, smacking Steamboat, and then losing by a few scores to Eaton. Prior to their season finale against Fort Lupton, I'm not sure if they could make the postseason if they won this, but they did not give themselves a chance, dropping a close one, 17-12 against Fort Lupton to end their season at 4-5. They look ahead to this season on the 1A level to see if that levels out the playing field a little bit and maybe even make the postseason here, as they really only graduate a few seniors here. I'm looking at Jeff McCord, who was the senior with the most tackles at 33 and 1 for loss in kind of a shallow senior defensive group that saw Will Reed and Jamie Elliott all land in the top 8 of tackles, but spread out enough for returners to pick up the slack. And then looking elsewhere with McCord, Reed, and then Caleb Bobb, all those guys forced a turnover, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but when the team as a whole only forced 9, that means that you lose 33% of turnovers generated. But let's talk about the bright spots here, because there are plenty here at Forge Christian as far as returning playmakers, starting off with Sam Granillo here, who had the most turnovers forced with 2 fumble recoveries as a sophomore, and was already listed at 6 foot, 210 pounds. He should make a high impact as well at the guard position. You also get back Dante Vigil here, headlining the defense with 70 tackles and 4 of those being in the backfield. And Carson Craig matched Vigil's efforts in tackles for loss at 4 and did so in just 46 tackles for himself. So very efficient at making plays in the backfield. You also get Ethan Maxwell and Strange here, who had 39 combined solo tackles, and both had a couple of tackles in the backfield. Overall, of the 11 tacklers who had double-digit tackles, 8 of them come back to this unit. But offensively, this is where the real fireworks are going to be, because anybody who ran for over 100 yards comes back. You're looking at Tafoya here, who led the way, having rushed for 657 yards last season, to go with Vigil's 7 rushing scores and 606 yards for a nice 1-2 punch. And at quarterback, they seem to roll out 2 different guys, often with the junior Sullivan Strange here throwing for 295 yards and 2 scores to 2 picks at a 38% completion rate. And then sophomore, a.k.a. incoming junior, Trayson I here, who threw for more yards at a higher completion rate, but also threw more INTs here than touchdowns. But when comparing their ability to pack the run game, Strange is definitely a more dynamic athlete with a long of 55 to just I's 22, and the yards per carry edge going to Strange. Yet I found himself in the end zone 3 times, which was more than Strange. And Strange, I think, is a bit more of a better use at receiver, honestly, to return with some other substantial receiving talent here in Quentin Torres, Brendan Hardy, and Joey Shelton, who all caught for over 100 yards, and that core had 5 receiving touchdowns. If they could just iron out and use Sullivan Strange as an athlete, as I think he's intended to be used, this team could be really, really good this year. But they do have some tough opponents out the gate here. They start off in Wiggins, Colorado. Stay tuned for that season preview. That's coming out on Wednesday. And that just seems like a little too hot to handle here. I am going to favor Wiggins in that game on the road. But then against the Academy, I think that they bounce back with a win. Before going against Devlin, I do think that Devlin should probably win this matchup this year. But, I mean, they showed that they could beat them last year, and they are returning the majority of their team. We'll just see how much Devlin progresses through 3 games in their season. And then their second to last non-league game is going to be against Kent Denver here, and then they play Manitou Springs. I don't think that they beat Kent Denver, but I do really like this team being either 2-3 or 3-2 heading into league play, and I think that this is their league to lose, if I'm being completely honest. I think that Prospect Ridge Academy, we saw how that went last year. At Flatirons Academy, that really is for the league title, and I'm going to talk about Flatirons Academy next, and you'll understand why. But, I think that that's going to be an interesting game to basically see who gets this playoff spot here. But I'm going to favor Forge Christian for now, but like I said, either way. And then Platte Canyon and Denver Christian, I think that they should win those games. So, I mean, at worst, they go 3-1 in league. And outside of league, I think even at worst, they go still 2-3, making up for a 5-4 record. I think that they should have a winning record at the end of this year here. But I honestly think more realistically, we're looking at a season where they win 4, 5, 6, 7 games and probably only drop 2. So that puts their window of wins, by the way, for anyone counting at home, between 5 and 7. And I like this team really to be on the high end of that and go 7-2 and make a playoff run in their very first season in 1A. But that is going to be an earned trip here, as they do have the Bison of Westminster here in the way, trying to prevent that and get a playoff punch of their own here. Looking at last year's season, they kind of struggled out the gate against 2 playoff teams before bouncing back with a 50-burger win themselves, and then dropped a game to Denver West. Now, after a 3-game win streak over the Pinnacle, Manual, and then a forfeit win against Sheridan that served as an impromptu bye week, might have hurt them as they'd lose their last 2 league games to Highland and Estes Park here to wrap up their season. But as far as graduating seniors here, there's only one for me to really talk about, being Luke Miller, who was the only senior high-level contributor, collecting 2 interceptions and a pass deflection here. Let's go ahead and get started on this returning playmaker segment, because there is plenty of verbiage to go through here. I'm looking at last year's junior class, who comes in locked and loaded with plenty of guys like Jonah Burgess here. 6 interceptions, 5 pass breakups, leading receiver, stellar offensive weapon, leading tackler. Jonah Burgess could be an MVP candidate this next season, depending on how it goes and if this team is able to win some games and make the playoffs. They also return their top 4 tacklers. That includes Jonah here, who returns for their senior year, and Ryan Coulter, 7 TFLs and 4 sacks. Parker Wilson is number 3. He had 2 interceptions and 4 pass breakups, along with his workload at QB, and Ian Elvington. They also return lineman Sean Osterman, who had 3 TFLs and was listed at 6'3" last year. Louis Mandy was only a sophomore when he became second on the team in TFLs at 5. And then Caleb Dowdy's freshman campaign was a pleasant surprise, as he was tied for second in pass breakups with 4, while also notching an interception. As mentioned before, Burgess led receiving with 5 receiving touchdowns and 287 yards, catching passes from Parker Wilson, throwing those passes and rushing 300 yards worth of damage for a total of 10 touchdowns for the quarterback, and Burgess was not far behind with 234 rushing yards of his own. Coulter was the primary back, leading the team in carries and yards, going for 335, but the leader in scores was Elijah Rika here. The sophomore ran for 5 touchdowns and 315 yards in this backfield by committee that went for over 1,000 cumulative yards, and all come back this next season. So let's go and look at this schedule here. That does look like a little bit of a doozy here outside of league. They start off the season at Highland in Highland. They have not always had great success against this squad here. I think that could be a tough loss. But as far as building a tough schedule for playoff strength here, they have 2 great games here at Lyman, at Peyton. I don't necessarily think that they win either of those games, but as far as strength of schedule goes, this is going to be fantastic for their RPI and their evaluation from Max Preps as far as rankings, as well as probably CHASA as well, especially if they can fare well in one of these games and maybe even push Peyton to be within, 14 points, 10 points. They then get at home against Estes Park and Manual. They should definitely win those 2 games to head into League 2 and 3. And their very first game in League is going to be Forge Christian. That will set the tone for the remainder of this league, as they should beat Platte Canyon, Denver Christian, and Prospect Ridge Academy, in my opinion. So, I mean, at worst, you're looking at 5 wins, and then this game against Forge Christian is literally everything. I don't think that they do better than 6-3, so it's going to be a really small window of wins of 5 to 6, and I am going to project them to go 5-4 on this season here. But like I said, they have a very strong chance of winning this league at 6-3 and punching their ticket to the postseason. Now, the team that is going to be missing from this league this season is going to be Sheridan High School. They had to forfeit like almost all their games except for, I want to say, like the first 2 last year. And so they're going to go ahead and just regather themselves and only play a junior varsity season. So if you're wondering where Sheridan High School is, they are getting their, looks together, getting their personnel together, and building for next year. And that'll do it for this season preview set here. I talked about Montezuma Cortez, Alamosa, Bayfield, Salida, Pagosa Springs, Denver Christian, Platte Canyon, Forge Christian, Flatirons Academy, and gave an update on the Sheridan program. Doing so by talking about their previous season, their graduated seniors, their returning playmakers, and then projecting their upcoming season. I still got one more of these in me before I will pass you off to Gideon. But leading up to my season previews, Coach V and Gino also have season previews for every single team, 1A through 5A. So go ahead and give all of those a listen. Anywhere that you listen to podcasts, whether that be on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or even our YouTube, just look up Playmakers Corner on any of those platforms. And if you are not already, make sure that you are following or subscribed so that way you get notifications anytime you want to listen to an episode. Go ahead and adjust that in your notifications in your settings on your phone, or go ahead and stay tuned to our social medias, such as at Playmakers Corner on Instagram, at Playmaker Corner on Twitter/X, at Playmakers Corner on TikTok while it's still around here, and our Facebook Playmakers Corner, where we have all of our episode covers posted and let you know when that's going to come out, as well as other content like power rankings and all kinds of fun jazz watch lists. And stay tuned as we get ready to talk about the tackle football season and the girls flag football season, the inaugural season, I should say, according to CHASA recognition. So thank you all so much for paying attention to everything that we have to offer y'all. I have been your host for this episode, Kodey Stoffer, and be sure to follow us on all those platforms for tons of more content. Peace out.